Hello, busy dads and busy people everywhere. Welcome to another episode of the Busy Dad podcast. My guest today is Duncan Walsh. Duncan is a fellow Burpee practitioner, a fellow YouTuber, and somebody I've been interacting with for about 3 years now. Duncan has left many comments on my YouTube channel, and I've learnt a great deal from every one of them. Very often, I'll come out of a workout feeling pretty good about myself, and there'll be the usual stream of encouraging comments, and then there'll be a comment saying something like, "I think you threw it away in minute 17. Are you sure you couldn't have got extra in that final minute? Couldn't you have summoned a sprint if someone had had a gun to your head?" And I absolutely love the fact that Duncan sees potential in me as a sportsman and an athlete with decades more experience than I have. And instead of letting me rest on my laurels, constantly pushes me to push myself harder and to expect more from myself. He's been something of a coach figure to me for many years. I think more than I've expressed to him, benefited from his interaction with me on the channel. And so I thought it would be a wonderful thing to get him onto the podcast to share some of his insights. Because when Duncan is giving me that kind of coaching, he is only extending me the same respect that he extends himself. He was a professional squash player, and he built his capacity through sheer grit and hard work, something we touch on in the episode is that he never quite had the technical prowess to get all the way to the top tier of squash, but what he did have was the work ethic. And so Duncan shares some lessons that he's learned about drive and mindset, something that could be a benefit to all of us. And towards the end of the episode, he also touches on some form modifications that you might consider making if, like him, you have issues in your lower body, be it in your hips, your lower back. I think he had an issue in his quads. So if you head on over to Duncan's channel, it's linked in the show notes, you'll see his reps don't look quite like mine. For sure they don't. By his own admission, they look a bit strange. But these are modifications that he has made that have allowed him to perform the movement safely. And you'll see the man is in phenomenal physical condition. So clearly he's getting an excellent training stimulus out of this way of training. So if you are someone who has had issues, check out the way Duncan's doing it over on his channel. Go and show the man some love. He's got a ton of wisdom to share. He brings a kind of lightness of touch and a good cheer to everything he does. I think he's just a very valuable asset in this community. So Duncan Walsh, my friends, I enjoyed this conversation and I think you will too. Here he is. Duncan Walsh, welcome to the Busy Dad podcast, my man. I'm very, very excited to be picking your brains today. For those of you who don't know Duncan, Duncan is deep in the game. He has been a dedicated practitioner of one kind or another for many, many years and many decades. And in that time, he has amassed some really valuable wisdom that I hope he'll be able to share with us today. Duncan, maybe you could begin just by giving people a rough sense of your training background, your training story.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I did want to say, first of all, Max, I mean, huge congratulations to yourself on what you've created here, because not only are you providing something that is motivating people, but you're providing something and you've created something that is inspiring people to improve their lives. And, sometimes we can not see the impact of what we're doing on something like this, but it really is something that can change people's lives. So it's a fantastically good thing that this whole program creates, more than just workouts. It's a whole, it really does change people's lives. It's not a sort of hyperbole to say that, really. But yeah, I guess my story, just in an elevator pitch, I used to play professional squash. My introduction to the game was a little bit more unusual because I started so late. Started when I was 19, and then I was just knocking around in a leisure centre. Had no thoughts that I could potentially go professional at that time. You know, people are often world beaters at 19 already.
Mm.
But got into it more and more, and did get to a level that was not too bad. But one thing I realised, that when I was in the world rankings, I was the only person that never played junior squash, and that was quite an eye opener, because it showed that when people play, especially racquetball, the sport of squash, at racket sports, that it takes years to hone those skills, perfect your technique, movement patterns, skill patterns. So yeah, squash sort of, I felt like, unbeknown to me at the time, I was sort of shackled by a limited and flawed technique.
Mm.
Um, but I did okay. I got to about, officially, I got to about 94 in the world. And I beat people that, my best win was someone who was 12 in the world. I trained as if I wanted to be world number one.
Mm.
But like I say, unbeknown to me, really, I had these limitations of technique.
I remember we were chatting, Duncan, and you told me that there was a period in your training history where you were training something like 10 hours a day.
Yeah, yes. Well, I got a deal with a guy in Hull, where he was going to give me free accommodation, and I thought, fantastic, and he would pay me to play those leagues. There was a system of leagues that you could play, and it ended up being an old changing room in the squash club. So for about 9 months, I lived in an old changing room at the squash club, and there was another guy there as well who became a really good training partner. But during that time, I was almost doing sort of Ironman triathlons on a daily basis. It was just, I had days where I would start at 6:30 a.m. and finish at 1 a.m. the following day. But then I would sleep for 10 to 12 hours every night, because changing rooms don't have windows. So you would just wake up after being solidly asleep for 11 hours and then do the same again. And it was a period when I did some huge training sessions, what I used to call anaerobic endurance sessions. In other words, they should have been shorter, high intensity sprint sessions,
Mm.
but they ended up being an hour and a half of sprint sessions. So it wasn't, normally you have an endurance session, a volume session, and then you have higher intensity, which is shorter. But the fitter you get, the more you're able to maintain a higher intensity. So before you know it, it's escalating on.
Where did that obsession come from? I mean, I often fantasize about the idea of being able to lock myself up in a room and just do 3,000 burpees a day. Um, but I've never done it. I'm at a point
Well,
in my life now where I probably couldn't with my other responsibilities. You were quite young at this time, but still a lot of young people, they're not locking themselves up in a changing room and just training 12 hours a day. Where did that
yeah,
come from?
yeah. Well, that's a good question, to be honest. And that is the question, really, because I didn't tell anyone this at the time. I may have told one or two people, but basically, when I was 19, I actually had a bit of a revelation. And I was doing biology, chemistry, physics in Manchester before I then packed that in I got a job, and then I played squash. And I did a sports science degree, but it was really an excuse to play squash. But I was doing that, and I was in a canteen once, and I sort of had a revelation, really, that I would one day be world champion. And it just hit me, and I just thought, right, okay. And then from that point onwards, I played squash. And as I was persisting, so I was still playing full time at 38. I'd be playing people that were 15 years younger than me, and always knew that I had to be able to compete fitness wise with a 22-year-old whilst at 38, for example. And I kept going. And ironically, when I was 40, I did actually become technically a world champion, because it was the 40 and over veterans. So there were world class players, ex world class players and everything, that are maintaining it to 40. And I managed to win that, which technically made me a world champion. So the premonition was actually correct, but it was it was a mission that I was on for 20 years. And in a way, I never looked, even at say 38, 39, I sort of strangely never lost the faith. I just thought, well, it's going to happen. It's just a case of when it happens. And it did, strangely, in a compromised way.
Yeah, not in the way that you imagined it, and it
Yeah,
never
yeah,
happens in quite. You never get what you bargained for, but you
that's
get
right.
something. Yeah, wow.
Yeah. So that really. Uh, so yeah, but along that way, so then after there, I actually went into sort of a business. I developed a sports product, which sort of segues into, because it was sports headphones, but they had workouts integrated into the sports headphones with an MP3 player. So I went through about 10 years of developing, patenting, and ultimately selling that. And that was actually very difficult to do. I made it waterproof so that you could swim with it as well. But in the end, I managed to get it into Walmart, and it was a patented product, and etc. So, but that was a very difficult time, because it really made you a problem solver, because there were so many. You were inundated with problems on a daily basis. You're dealing with China manufacturers, etc. So yeah, so that led me up to that, and then I actually got married, a couple of kids, became a busy dad, and then recently, probably about a couple of years ago, got into saw the burpees. I think it was the Iron Wolf that I did see, but I also saw you. So it was I'd missed the start of it,
Hmm.
and I did see Iron Wolf do some of his. And my first thought was, okay, let's have a go at this, because I was already doing circuits that were
Hmm.
very, very useful. The idea of, let's say, a 20-minute circuit, which might incorporate different exercises, but did include burpees. And it was just so convenient, no equipment required, which are fundamentals of obviously the Busy Dad program. And I just thought these are a fantastic way of exercising. You don't need to go to a gym. You can do them anywhere. I've done them in a hotel room, on a balcony, just on a side road. I've seen you do them at the side of a house, and it's just such a fantastically convenient source of exercising. And it's funny. I remember saying I think it was Osiris. What do you
Hmm.
remember? Yeah,
Yeah, of
and
course.
I just saying that if you have a spot where you train, how you can become emotionally attached to
Absolutely.
a 2 meter by 2 meter square.
Yeah.
In years to come, you'll look back at your basement and think the toil and sweat and heart and soul that
Mm-hmm.
went into that space.
Yeah.
It needs a plaque. I
Yeah.
think you should get a plaque for that space. Um, so yeah, they're a fantastic way of training,
Mm.
in whatever connotation. But yeah, I guess we were discussing before about the mental side, weren't we? And
Hmm.
how do you sort of how do you sort of sort of how do you rate it within your sessions? To what percentage do you attribute your sessions? Is psychological a big part, the
Yeah.
physiological?
No, for sure, for sure. I mean, and I want to hear your take on this. One of my guys recently asked me how often I think that a 6 count session, I fail it because of a physiological limitation versus failing it because of a psychological limitation. And I told him I've never failed a 6 count session because of a physiological limitation. Um, I really believe that everything that holds us back in these sessions is in the mind. Especially, it's funny, I think with the SEALs, you can make an argument that there is a point where the muscles just give out. Um, they just stop working anymore. You just can't
I guess
complete
there has
another
to be,
press up.
doesn't there? Yeah,
Um,
physiologically, yeah.
but with the 6 counts, I know every time I've not hit the target, the reps were there for me, but I couldn't get my head around it.
Yeah, my worst point is usually 30, actually, because I've just got into it,
Mm, mm,
and then you're just getting a first sort of oxygen debt, and depending on how well you've warmed up,
Mhm.
You may be getting to some sort of steady state or
Mhm.
whatever, and it's a long way to go.
Yeah.
And that's the point for me that I'm most likely to think. So I immediately solve that by having a base camp, which I was talking to you before, which is beyond 30 that I have to get to, that gets me past that weak point. So I know, let's say if your first base camp is 50,
Mm.
then it sort of detracts away from that 30 point. If I didn't have anything in my head, I'd get to 30 and think, oh, long way to go. I've only just started. I don't feel that good already. And whereas if I give myself a base camp beyond that, I've got to get to that, and then I consider the view from that base camp.
Mm.
And I've already got past 30, so that's that's distant history then.
Yes.
But we were saying about how one would nurture mental resilience,
Mhm. Mhm.
and I think just my own very quick story. I remember when I think I was about 9 or 10, I think possibly earlier, actually 8. And my mother said to me, she said, you can do, it sounds like a cliche now to an adult, but you can do anything you want if you put your mind to it. And she said it with such conviction that I just thought, okay, that's the way life is. If there's whatever you want to do, you just put your mind to it and you can do it. So it was more of a factual statement, really, rather than something that was encouraging. So I found myself going through life thinking, well, you sort of think, maybe foolishly, but you sort of think, well, I can do it. I just have to put my mind to it.
Mhm.
And I know when I was 10, I used to cycle to my grand's, and we were in Worsley in Lancashire, and they were in Chorley, so it was 16 miles away. And I had an old bike that was, I mean, it would weigh probably 3 times what bikes are today. And I was a little old 10-year-old. And we'd go on the dual carriageway, not as many cars today. And the bike would break down. I'd be up the side of the road, slow puncture, fixing it, back on the bike, another couple of miles, the puncture goes. And then I'd eventually get there 16 miles later. And then in the evening, early evening, I'd cycle the 16 miles back. So 32 miles in a day. And I always say to my parents, what on earth were you doing letting a 10-year-old do? We would never do that now. I certainly wouldn't with my daughter. But there was no thought. I can remember my mentality at the time going along the road. And at no point did I think, oh, I can't do this. What am I going to do? I
Because
just,
your mum had told you you can do anything if you put your mind to it, and you'd taken that as gospel. Therefore,
that's
there
right.
must be a solution.
Yes. So I think when you mentioned before about self-belief and resilience, I don't know whether, I suppose to an extent as an adult, you can develop it and practice it. And the best way to strengthen yourself mentally is probably to go through very tough training sessions. If you get through them, that in itself will make you mentally very tough. But the best way, the sort of gold standard, I would say, is to instill it in your kids to start with. That's the gold standard. So as busy dads, we're obviously training, but it's important for us to instill in our children that level of self-belief, that level of resilience. And that I feel is the best way to, when you grow into an adult, and we take on board so strongly what our parents say to us. I remember one of your previous podcasters, Alex, when he really took on board when his father acted sort of, he was disappointed at a particular performance, and Alex remembered that.
Mm.
And so it's very easy for parents to just give an offhand comment about something, whereas a child may remember that when they're in their 90s. I
Yeah.
remember when my mother or father said that. So it really stays with the child. So we have to be careful sometimes of what we say. But if we sort of plant that seed carefully,
Mm.
then it can really sort of flourish
Yeah.
into that sort of mental resilience. So I guess that my answer to that would be, nurture it to start with, if possible, if in our kids. But then as we get older, the only real way to develop it is just to go through hell in training sessions, and you come out stronger.
Yes. Absolutely.
But,
Absolutely. Um, So I love this idea that your mother deposited that seed in you when you were young. She said you can do anything if you put your mind to it. And you proved her right with these 32-mile cycle rides when you were a 10-year-old. You had this epiphany at 19 years old that you were going to become a world champion squash player. Then you went into the bunker, trained for 10 hours a day throughout your 20s. You finally got what you were looking for as you turned 40.
Yeah.
And then all of the wisdom that you've built along the way, you apply for 10 years in a business context, all of a sudden developing the kind of problem solving, not just the willpower, but the kind of resourcefulness and problem solving abilities to deal with this technology that you're developing.
One thing I would just jump in to say that I think is important is that, you know, along that journey, so we obviously jumped from 19 to 40.
Yeah.
There were, the worst thing about that period was not the training. That was the least of my worries, really. The worst thing was the losing, because that's what you're aspiring to. And people used to look at me time and time again, oh, what a lifestyle, you're playing professional squash, you're jetting around the world, you know, fantastic. But to me, that was all irrelevant. I was just interested in that goal. And it's rather like yourself when you're going through the 6 counts and you're hitting 275, 280, 282, 285. You then hit a 291 and you think, I'm going to hit 300 the next time. And then it's a 275. Devastating. And you're not thinking about, oh, that was another good workout in the bag. It's devastating. You've just, you know, you got to the point where you think, right, I'm going to improve now. And then no, down the snake again in the game of snakes and ladders, and you back down again. And that ability to pick yourself up. And when I was playing matches, you know, I would be devastated if I lost. I would disappear usually into a toilet for about 15 minutes, sit there and just mull over the game. I wanted to get away from everyone. And within 15 minutes, I had to get out of there and I would go on a back court and do court sprints. And those court sprints always gave me a sort of a hope for the next time. So in other words, yeah, it's not happened today. You failed today, but here's hope for the next time. So I'm going to get fitter. So I would go on a back court, and it didn't matter if it was, because normally, let's say if you play one for a team, you would be on last. So sometimes I might get off court at 11:15 p.m., 11:30, and they'd be having their meal, and there was a gap in the table, and where's Duncan? Oh, usual place, he's doing court sprints, and I would be on a back court, sometimes in the dark, because the lights. Sometimes in the old fashioned, you needed a coin for the lights. So, but I wasn't going to let that stop me. So I would do court sprints, let my eyes attune to the darkness. I knew how many strides it took me to go length, backwards, backwards, backwards. So I'd almost count the lengths in the dark so that I don't crack into the wall. And I would do my 22 in a minute, 45 seconds rest, just enough for sets. And every time I came off there, and they were always worth their goal because they were harder than normal because you were already fatigued from the session. But I always came off, and it always gave me hope for the next time. And that's saying, again, a bit of a cliche, doing that bit extra gives you that bit extra. Yeah. And I used to do that with the burpees as I was trying to get going, because I'd do the 20-minute session, because I wasn't actually strictly adhering to the Busy Dad program at that time. But I'd do a tough 20-minute session, give my best effort, have 5 minutes rest, do another 5 minutes as well as I could, high intensity, another 5 minutes rest, and then go for it on another 5 minutes. Rather than sort of slowly sort of grade downwards in intensity, have a little break, then try and go hard again, another little break, try and go hard.
That's really
and
interesting.
That worked for me, actually.
So that was the sort of Busy Dad equivalent of your court sprints.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about the sort of, so just for people listening who are doing the program, what Duncan's describing is quite an interesting use of your time. I've never tried it myself. I think I will. You put in your 20-minute session, you pause the clock on your weekly minutes, rest five minutes, another 5 minutes of quality work, so up to 25 minutes out of your weekly budget, rest 5 minutes, another 5 minutes. That's, of course, a 40-minute time investment, which for some of the busy dads among us is tricky, especially given that you're only getting 30 minutes of training time out of that 40 minutes. But for those of us who can afford the time commitment to do that. What do you think is the training payoff of that approach?
Higher intensity. I think you get the 5 minutes after the 5 minutes rest. You would, let's say someone was able to maintain a six reps, 6 seals per minute rate. Well, if you continued on for it, then you would probably slow. Whereas that rest sort of it allows your body to get used to a higher rate of work. So you're still overloading because your main effort is always going to be the 20 minutes, but it's a form of overload, but you're able to overload still at a high level of intensity. So you've allowed yourself to rest, and then you may start to fatigue after 3 minutes, but you've still had that higher quality. I mean, you can mix it up. Someone may want to do a sort of a grind. I had a go at your 40-minute session, not yesterday, the day before yesterday.
Cool.
Of the seals, and because I hadn't tried 40-minute seals before, so that was great. So I enjoyed that. But obviously, you do slow down. So it's another option for that. But I did have one question for you, which may have a quick answer. But obviously, 2 of the criteria for you is the 2 sacred movements and 80 minutes. But what scope, and obviously that's the minimum, but do you allow people to have more than 80 minutes? If they think, well, I'm actually having good, can I do 100 minutes in the week, or do I have to go, well, that was a tough 20 minutes, but I've got some time. I wouldn't mind trying to overload a bit to try and further improve up the progression, of numbers. Do you is that allowed to do more than 80 minutes?
Not officially, no.
Right.
And I think, I have a lot of my really enthusiastic coaching clients come to me and say, come on, I want to train 150 minutes or whatever it is. I really want you going into every session starving hungry. I want you so excited for your burpee training. And as soon as we start to think of 80 minutes as the baseline rather than the precise amount that you will do every week, I worry that you're not going to cherish those minutes as much. You're not going to put as much thought and time and preparation into them. And ultimately, if you go too far beyond the 80 minutes, the quality, you'll just start to dilute the quality of each individual minute. And so I have found that, I did not have unlike you, I did not have a history of applying myself consistently to any physical endeavor. I've not missed a minute in more than 5 years with this practice. And I think that, thinking of the 80 minutes as the precise number that you have to do week in, week out, not a minute more, not a minute less, is really key for consistency. I think there's something about starting to think of the number as a baseline that then opens the door to a ton of extra training, which then distracts you from the core commitment, which then perhaps opens you to overtraining, psychological burnout. And so even if on a week in, week out basis, it could be very beneficial to add some minutes. If you have a slightly longer time frame and you're thinking about ensuring consistency over a longer period, I think it's dangerous. And so ultimately, I'm quite strict about the exactly 80 minutes for that reason.
And if it was compressed into the first part of the week, and so let's say it was over 4 days, and then there was day 5, 6, and 7 as rest days, and that would still you want to keep the purity of the 80 minutes, even if they had a blast of 4 days, then a full recovery of 3 days, and then attack the 80 minutes. So it's quite sort of strict with 80 minutes, not a second more, not a second less.
It is. It is. But, and you can break up that 80 minutes however you want. I mean, I've had to do 8, 10-minute workouts in the past. There was one time when I was very ill throughout the week, and I kept putting off the session. But I fully intended to do the 80 minutes, and I ended up bundled in
10:40 p.m. you said?
Yeah, 10:40 p.m. on a Sunday night. So it has to be done. It has to be done one way or another. But we don't want to go beyond that.
And interesting, just a slight change of subject, but the because this is really more about the information that's put out there, training information, I guess, on the internet. And I always think that, because it's always, the water is always muddied by people that they're obviously trying to sell a book, or they're looking for clicks, and things like this, clickbait. And, when you've got the fundamentals of training, let's say there were 5 fundamentals, just for the sake of argument. Once those have been stated and established, how do people really then make money off restating what people already know? They have to reinvent it, or say, oh no, what you've been taught is not is not correct, And sort of one of those things is, for example, zone 2 training. Now, as a question to yourself, as an estimate, if you're doing a tough 6 counts or seals session, 20 minutes, what percentage would you say of that 20 minutes is zone 2?
Yes,
which they advocate 80% of your training should be zone 2.
Yeah. You know what? I've never worn a heart rate monitor. I couldn't tell you, but not very much of it. I think I'm bypassing zone 2 in about 10 reps.
Yeah. And I think the reason for that is that it's always quoted for elite athletes. So if you're doing a huge volume of training, most of your training probably will be zone 2, because you couldn't hammer it at zone 4 and 5 for huge volumes, because you would just break down. So a lot of their training is zone 2, and then they'll have the VO2 max training and speed and all the rest of it. But it has to be. But if you're a busy dad or mum, and you've got 20-25 minute sessions, or 4 times a week, or the 20 times 4, if you had 80% in zone 2, it's too easy.
Yeah, for sure.
And there was one person, a lady, I've forgotten her name now actually, and she made the point that if you're HIIT training, it doesn't really apply, because otherwise it would be too easy. Right. You're likely going to be in zone 3 and 4 for most of the time. So it's a bit of a misnomer of this zone 2, like, 80% of my training has to be zone 2.
Yeah.
But I think with HIIT, with an effort like this, it doesn't apply really.
I agree with you. I will say that burpees become almost a form of prayer, meditative, reflective, very edifying movement if you do stay in zone 2. Occasionally I've done it where I put on some Gregorian chant, and I set aside, I've done this like twice as rewards for myself at key junctures in my life. Like after I finished my PhD, I treated myself to 60 minutes of slow zone 2 6 counts with some Gregorian chant. And it's a wonderful thing, but that's not what we're about here, because as you say, we've got 80 minutes. There's no way. How many would you have done in that, do you think? If you'd have maintained about a zone 2 in 20 minutes, how many 6 counts would that equate to, do you think? Over 20, I reckon I could probably stay in zone 2 and get 200 6 counts.
200
over 20, I reckon. Yeah. I'm pretty conversational at 200.
Yeah, so that's one way of quantifying it, isn't it? For yourself, zone 2 would be 200, which is a long way. So you're obviously not in zone 2 for most of the time.
No. That's my recommendation tends to be, and I think you and I are kindred spirits on this, but I want to get your thoughts. Train as hard as you can every time you train. That's basically my approach, which is not based on any scientific literature. It's just, maybe it's not even a recommendation, more a confession of how I train. That's just, I cannot help but go into a session and give it everything or almost everything. Sometimes I strategically hold back a few reps. Usually I kick myself afterwards, but we're talking the difference between 100% effort and 95% effort. I mean, what's your approach to your sessions in terms of your perceived rate of exertion?
Yeah, I think that is more conducive to this format of training. I think if you had to do a bigger volume, so let's say you do 20 minutes burpees, and then you've got to go for so you get the quality in the event that you are most trying to perform in, give your high performance, but then you want to increase your endurance, so you might want to go for a run, or you might want to do some weight training, or whatever it is, plyometrics or something. And so for example, there would be times when I'd do my say court sprints, and I get the maximum quality out of that, and then I'd have a break, and I think, but I want to increase my time on my feet, so I could have a killer court sprint session, but it's only 30 minutes. Well, a tough game of squash might be an hour and a half. So I've got to increase my energy capacity to up to an hour and a half. So I'd go for a run. But then my run wouldn't be necessarily all out run. It would be maybe a zone 2, zone 3. But I mean, I'm still increasing my energy reserves, my ability to produce energy. And I think the bigger background of training you've got, the more easily you can pull from that when you're having a bad day.
Mm-hmm.
The bigger background you have. If you've got a smaller background of training, then when you're having a bad day, you've got less to draw on. You know,
right.
So I think the all out is more conducive to pretty much all of mine. Are a best effort on the day. But then I guess it comes back to the psychological of, was it actually a best effort?
Right.
And it comes back to a couple of little anecdotes I got for in terms of psychological. One of them was a guy who was playing squash. He came back from a tournament, and we sat down with a tuna cob, in the bar, and said, okay, let's go over the game. Why do you think you lost? And he came up with about at least a dozen reasons. Well, I started doing this, and then he was doing that, and I started doing this. And when we listed them, I said, every single factor that you've mentioned here is psychological. He didn't say, oh, I just got too tired, I got slow, I couldn't get to the ball quick. Everyone was psychological. And it was a real eye-opener for him. He's yes, you're right. It's all psychological. So that was one. I remember coaching a lady once, and she was quite contrary, shall we say. If you said ABC, she would say, no, DEF. So part of her session was that the first bit she had to do a 2-mile run. But we used to, and this is talking about base camps as well, you never do a 2-mile run. You'd say, well, we'll just get to that lamppost. So we'll get to the lamppost down the road. We'll get to there first of all, because you probably can't run the whole 2 miles continuously. Oh, well, I think I can. Well, okay, if you can, that's great. But you probably can't. So we'll go to the lamppost. Well, I think I can get to the 2-second lamppost, all the way around, sorry. Whereas if I'd have said, we're going to go all the way round in one go, she said, oh, I can't do that. That's too far.
Yeah.
Well, I think you can. No, I can't. So immediately you were playing psychological games, which made me think about the base camps. And I don't know how you approach, if you think, right, I'm going to get 300 plus, let's say, on a particular day. Do you have psychological base camps, your approach to 100, and you don't think of anything beyond 100, you're only focused on 100? Because the view from that 100 is then entirely different. Once you're at 100, you're there, that they've gone now. Do you have psychological base camps like that? Or at this rep 7, are you thinking, 293 to go?
Yeah, I cannot entertain that thought. That kills me every time. I've tried that. I think that there are people out there, I suspect this was true of Iron Wolf, who just thought like that. Got 500 to do. I've got 461 left. Let's do them all. I can't do that. I can't wrap my head around the entire rep count in one thought. It kills me. And so absolutely, I'm splitting the workout into all kinds of structures. What's interesting for me is the frame of reference is constantly changing. So sometimes the base camp, I think to myself, for example, I don't know about you, but when I'm doing 300 4-second rep count, I'm thinking in terms of 20-second batches of 5 reps. I know there are 60 of them. And at any given point, I might say to myself, okay, get through this next 20 seconds. And that's what I need to think. And then we'll reassess. But then sometimes I need to get more of an aerial view of where I am in the workout. So then I say, okay, you're on the second 4-minute block. I often think in terms of 4-minute blocks. You're coming up for the 8-minute mark. Okay, just hold out till here, and then we'll, as you say, then we'll reassess. We'll see the lay of the land. Then sometimes I'll think in terms of the whole workout. Okay, you're 80% of the way through. And then sometimes I think I'm at that level for too long, and I have to think, right, you better concentrate on this rep. You better remind yourself how your fingertips are feeling and tune in with your body again, because if you don't, you're going to lose concentration. And I've found that the kind of art of staying in the workout is not staying in at any one place for too long. I'm constantly altering my perspective. Does that resonate with you?
Yes, I think my own approach is I tend to think more rep based than time based. So you're sort of I get through the next 20 seconds, or I get to a certain time. Is that right? Is that
Yeah, I mean, often those times are synonymous with rep numbers. Like, for example, I'm very much thinking in terms of 75s for the first 5 minutes. Get through this first 75, which is this first 5 minutes. But yes, I would say because it's completely even. That is how I'm trying to get through that landscape.
so 75 is the number you want to get at for
Every 5 minutes. Yeah. Yeah.
every 5 minutes, right? Okay, so you're working on 75, 150, 225. Yeah. Okay. And does that work for you then?
Like I said,
What are the downfalls in that? Do you hit a point mid 75, let's say in the third quarter, where you suddenly go a bit shaky, or?
yeah, I mean, one of the downfalls I think is you remember how 75 felt last time.
Yeah.
And if 75 this time feels different to how 75 felt last time, you can start to get in your head, oh man, how am I going to get even to 10 minutes if it's feeling this bad at 5?
So is 75 in the second half of the workout potentially too far a base camp to get to?
Potentially, but
Or,
then I think the danger of if the base camp shrinks to just get through the next rep, you get through the next rep, and then you think, bloody hell, I've got another 120 of these. How am I going to do that? And so
yeah,
I'm constantly contracting and expanding the perspective.
yeah. I do like to go at try a minute. So wherever if I get to a round number, let's say it was 150, and I sort of check the watch, see where I am, and then I think, okay, am I going to maintain, let's say 15 for the next minute? So I'll count 15 and then look at my watch, and let's say it started at the quarter past or at 15 seconds past, and then did I hit 15 seconds on 15 reps? Or whatever it was, whatever the time was. So did I get 15? So okay, now am I going to get 30 in the next minute for the 2 minute point? And then if I sort of it might click on, or it's just gone past, and I think, oh, I'm on 2 minutes. That took me 2 minutes and 2. So I work on a sort of a basis, but I also have a point where I know I'm going to start upping it. So your approach is it seems like you like to be regimented, like true to the process and an even pacing, whereas I tend to get to about 270 and then I'm winding it up. Yeah, so I think, okay, a bit like if you're on a track and it's ding ding, the bell's gone, and they all start winding it up.
Yeah.
And that home straight gives you that, whether it's a bit of it, so you're almost relying on sources to give you a boost of adrenaline to think bing bing, and the bell's gone, and now and we're off. So I've got another little base camp of about 270, let's say,
and then it's go
where
time.
I'm winding it up. And it's amazing how you think that you're not going to be able to wind it up. And this is the whole thing when you used to say, if I had a gun to my head, I could have squeezed out the reps.
Yeah.
Well, put a gun to your head, give yourself a reason to. So, but I do like to end on that finishing sprint or winding it up, whereas you like to stay to the process. So,
but I think that is just cowardice on my part. I used to sprint way more at the end. I have such trouble wrapping my head around the idea of upping the intensity in those last 5 minutes.
It's surprising how it's there.
It is there. I know.
And it is there, yes.
It's there. It's there. I know, man. Yes. You're so right. I think on that note, a good place for us to end would be for you to share with people, what is the $1 billion syndrome?
Well, that was basically, it used to be the £1 million syndrome. But I used to apply that mentality on days where you've got another session to do, or it's one that it's going to be tortuous, and you've got to, there's no sort of, you've got to maintain a pace. You can't just plod your way through it. And I just used to think, well, if someone was going to give you £1 million, could you do it? It's the same as hold a gun to your head scenario. And you'd think, so that would be a test. Can I not do this because of motivation?
Right.
Or can I just not do it? Am I physically incapable of doing this? Or if someone walked in the room and said, I will give you today $1 billion, could you do it? And in a lot of scenarios, you can do it.
Yeah.
It's just down to, and it's a test to see, is it down to motivation or is it not? And that's the thing, trying to apply that mentality as often as possible, even within a workout. You know, could I push now? Well, if someone put a gun to, or, you know, the $1 billion gave me now, could I push? Could I find it? And it's, you know, all that will result in is someone giving you an adrenaline boost. You are making your body give you that adrenaline shot to make you work. It's there, you can do it. You almost need an adrenaline shot. You know, if someone walked in the room and shouted at you boot camp style, you would find it.
You know what? I remember so clearly. I went to support my little sister. She was doing a park run in the UK. You know, these park runs that people do on Saturdays.
Yeah.
And I was standing at the finish line, the last 100 meters, and just as an experiment, I started yelling at people. All these oldies hobbling along. Come on! And they all just accelerated across the finish line, shaved 5 seconds off their time. And so, but the question is, how do you access that voice when you're on your own in the basement and no one really cares? You've got to internalize it, and you've got to find it.
Sometimes you have to sort of almost get annoyed at yourself. You know, it's just a come on, you know, and you can sort of, don't let the session beat you. I'm not going to be beaten by the session. It's you against the workout. And so I'm not going to let, it's almost a competitive aspect. You know, the workout is trying to grind you down, pull you down. I'm going to try and defeat it. You know, I've got to defeat the workout. And it's you against the workout, you know.
Personify the workout.
I did want it to do, because I wrote it down. I just thought I'll put the seed in there as a potential something for you to think about, that if there ever was a adaptation, a Busy Dad 2.0, that the opportunity, or the thought, talk is cheap, that potentially could be an introduction to a session, which could be, and you might even have the gradations up to a graduation, the different levels of maybe a 10 minutes 6 counts and a 10 minutes Navy SEALs 20-minute period. Or you could have a 6 counts and SEALs, or maybe SEALs and 6 counts.
And what do you think would be the advantage of putting them both into a single session like that?
Well, the first thing is that it's then psychologically, it may not be quite as daunting to sort of I've got 20 minutes of grind of these SEALs or 6 counts. It's a shorter base camp, and it's a variation, so it gives you that, and it mixes up the movement of the 6 counts and the advantages of that movement to the advantages of the Navy SEALs in one session, and you get a mixer. And it may also allow you to go at a faster pace for the 6 counts, or a faster pace for the SEALs. So if, for example, if you were doing 80, if you did 80 in your first 10 minutes, that might be a pace that you might hit potentially when you're trying to graduate. If you're going for your 150, I'm not sure what you'd want at the 10-minute point, but you might think, right, I could get to 80. But on a graduation day, you might hit 80 at 10 minutes and hit 150 at 20 minutes. But for a 10-minute session, you might think, well, I'm going to try and hit 85. Or even, or whatever, you know, or for your SEALs, or a higher number. So also then you might get a higher level of intensity in the first 10 minutes. But then testing yourself with the second 10 minutes. So you've got higher intensity, but then a survival grind in the second 10 minutes.
I might well try that in honor of you, Duncan. And that is, strictly speaking, permitted by the rules of the Busy Dad program. Non-standard, but kosher nevertheless. So I might mix them up.
Yeah, you'd probably have to try it to know the numbers to grade it to, wouldn't you?
Of course,
whatever.
absolutely.
But it was just a thought, anyway.
No, there's well, listen, it's so wonderful to have all of your training wisdom aboard. with the Busy Dad program, I'm really, really glad that you've joined our ranks and that you are deep in the game with lots of wisdom
Yes.
to share. I will definitely try one of those hybrid sessions. I will definitely try to tap into that billion-dollar mindset. For people listening who want to know a little bit more about what you're about, just quickly, Duncan, how can they find you?
Yeah, it's just on YouTube. Billion Dollar Syndrome, Duncan Walsh. That should do it. You'll have to excuse my technique. I never really said about that, but it's basically as a result of, you can't get away with all that training with no baggage, even a little bit. And chasing a squash ball around for all those decades does result in, I'm fairly good at a long lunge and chasing a ball around the court, but it actually sort of shapes your spine and your musculature after decades. It's not conducive to a deep squat. And what I found was that when I started doing the 6 counts, I was leaning forwards a lot, and it was putting the pressure on my vastus medialis on the quads. And I think, well, my legs are pretty good, but I'm feeling early on this sort of cramp in the first part. But once I widened my stance, it immediately alleviated it. So then I was able to enjoy doing the workouts with my own sort of technique.
There you go.
It actually put more pressure on the shoulders, actually, because you got further to go from the plank position. But it also might help Lee Hazard, because I know he's got a back injury at the moment, because that getting
wider base.
Yes, and if he's got a wider base, it would take the pressure off his back, rather than having to sort of arch it to come up. And it's more of a pivot from the hips. So it was just a thought, but that's why I have that form in my burpees, and my back feels great.
Great, that's good to know. And people who've had that issue, they should watch the way that you're doing it, and it has my full approval. Duncan, thank you so much for your time, my friend. I send everyone over to your channel. I hope that they will derive some real insight, and I hope to have you on again sometime. Thank you so much.
Yeah, enjoyed it.
Take care, my friend. Bye.
Thanks, Max.